Have you ever wondered, in those luxurious rooms where power and money reign supreme, does anyone truly care about the outsiders, those who are undervalued simply for lacking pedigree, family status, or the right background? Today's story is my journey, a woman who was once mocked, pushed out of every game just because she came from a public school and dared to dream big. But right where I was humiliated, I stood up, and with a single decision, I forced the very empire that once looked down on me to kneel and beg. This is not just a tale of revenge. This is a journey of reclaiming worth of justice and of paving the way for those who have ever been scorned like me. If you've ever felt small in that glittering world, listen to this story until the end. Because sometimes the invisible one is the very person who rewrites the rules for everyone. Chapter 1: The Dinner of Humiliation. If you've ever thought that a family dinner is simply a place where people gather to share little stories about work and life, I hope you've never had to sit at a table like the one I did that night. That was the night I realized sometimes the deepest wounds are carved not by shouts or fists, but by polite smiles and backhanded compliments. Benjamin, my husband, never belonged to the world of glamour, power, and million-dollar handshakes. He's gentle, sincere, a true software engineer, so down to earth that I once thought if there was anything keeping me from evaporating in this cold Silicon Valley society, it would surely be him. But his family was different, and I had naively believed that if I was sincere, I would be accepted. Meridian, a famous restaurant where every dish costs half a month's salary for a regular office worker, was so polished that just walking in made me feel like I was being scrutinized from head to toe. Just a frown from the waitress was enough to remind you exactly where you stood on the social ladder. The Wellington family had arrived first. Victoria, Benjamin's mother, sat at the head of the table, exuding the icy authority of someone used to commanding the world. Next to her was Harrison, my father-in-law, a man whose every nod, every laugh felt like a silent test of who was worthy of entering their circle. And Miranda, Benjamin's cousin, the golden princess of the venture capital world, once praised by Forbes for her multi-million-dollar deals, was also the first to smile at me in that way. Only women understand both welcoming and warning. Dinner began with the usual small talk. So, April, what do you do again? Victoria's tone was even as if she had memorized a script and was just waiting for something interesting to pass judgment on. I replied that I worked as an AI consultant for a startup, feeling myself shrink under their gaze, at once indifferent and scrutinizing. Miranda giggled. Wonderful sounds like technical support, but for artificial intelligence, right? That's so hands-on. I didn't respond, only offering a polite smile, because I knew at this table every compliment had a blade hidden in it. When the wine came, Harrison ordered an expensive white, whose name I would have to memorize just to pronounce correctly. He turned to me and politely asked, "April, would you like to try this? Or would you prefer something easier to drink?" I nodded and took the glass, replying simply, "I love Burgundy, actually." But I knew that easier to drink wasn't about taste. It was a test to see which class I belonged to. Victoria followed up as if she had just discovered something interesting. "Which school did you attend?" "April, University of California, Santa Cruz." I answered without hesitation. The whole table went silent for a moment. I saw Miranda glance quickly at her parents, the corner of her mouth curling into a strange smile. Victoria, meanwhile, stressed the words state school as if spelling out something unthinkable. Wonderful. Actually, I really admire people who choose a practical path. Working while studying, gaining experience. Very authentic, very grassroots. I knew the way she emphasized practical authentic was nothing more than a pat on the back for an outsider. The conversation went on revolving around Miranda's illustrious achievements, her first successful round of fundraising in New York Summit, conferences in Europe, million-dollar projects with major investment funds. They recounted it as if those things were the default, while everyone else was just along for the ride. Every now and then, Victoria would turn to me to ask about the little startups I consulted for her questions, seemingly attentive, but I could feel her just waiting for me to stumble so she could underline the distance. I sat there, my smile frozen on my face, telling myself that I just had to get through one more evening, just one more night, and everything would be okay. But the more I listened, the more I felt like an exhibit, a model put on display for their idea of diversity, when in reality, no one wanted to truly understand or recognize my actual worth. At the end of the meal, Miranda gracefully closed with, "You're really inspiring, April." I always admire people who overcome their background. Maybe success doesn't always require a fancy degree, right? Her hand rested on mine as light as a feather, but her gaze was sharp as a sentence. That night on the way home, Benjamin tried to hold my hand, whispering, "Don't mind them. They always talk like that. It'll be different tomorrow." I just smiled and nodded. But inside, a part of me no longer believed in comforting words like that. I knew from that moment I would never let anyone, not family, not people in the industry, ever have the right to diminish my worth again. And I also knew the real battle had only just begun. Chapter 2. Power Dynamics. The Wellington Family. I'd heard plenty about the Wellingtons long before I ever set foot in that dazzling room at Meridian that night. They weren't the type of family who only showed up on magazine covers or at million-dollar fundraising galas. No, the Wellingtons were an ecosystem of power and connections, where every handshake came with unspoken conditions, and every look was a silent contract. Only the strong and proper were ever allowed in. I still remember something Miranda once said in a magazine interview I happened to read a few years ago. Success in Silicon Valley isn't just about ideas. It's about pedigree, the blood running in your veins, and the academic record on your CV. It sounded bold, but I understood that beneath all that gloss was an exclusionary ideology, one that only opened doors to those who were qualified. And that was something I, a girl, who graduated from a state school and built her career from scratch, would never possess. The more time I spent around them, the more I realized each member of the Wellington family was like a root reaching deep into the soil of Silicon Valley, each with a role, but all fiercely believing one thing: a person's worth is defined by their social genetics. Victoria, the woman who built her career from nothing, but now defends her fortress of privilege with a vengeance as if she fears being devoured by people just like she once was. Harrison, wise, polite, but all of it serving a single purpose: to keep his family's gatekeeper status, controlling who gets a seat at the table. Miranda, the youngest generation, successful early, but who's never known real failure. She has everything: Ivy League degrees, a resume like a work of art, a circle of friends full of big names. But what Miranda lacks is the understanding of what it feels like to be excluded, something I and millions of others have lived through. To them, that dinner wasn't just a family gathering. It was a final test. Every question, every glance, every glass of wine poured was an invisible measure. The way Victoria mentioned her old professors, people who are now CEOs, tech billionaires. The way Miranda casually recounted meetings with famous founders as if it was just another day. Harrison subtly dangled relationships anyone would kill for, then turned to me with a polite smile. "April, what do you think are the real challenges for a founder?" Besides those little technical hiccups, I knew that wasn't a question looking for a real answer. They just wanted me to play the role of the outsider, a living prop in their story of how open-minded and diverse they were. I remember every look that slid over me, eyes that were both assessing and appraising. My part in their script had been set within minutes, and they were just waiting for me to slip up. But there was one thing they hadn't anticipated. I was already too familiar with being judged and categorized. Since graduating from a public university, jumping into tiny projects that no big name would ever invest in, I knew well the invisible walls this world erects for those who aren't enough. The times I'd been excluded from meeting rooms, the rejection emails with no explanation, the fake compliments I swallowed daily just for a chance to keep trying. I'd ask myself, why keep struggling to fit into a world that isn't made for me? But in those moments of being trampled, belittled, I found my resolve growing stronger. I wanted to prove to them and to myself that human worth isn't a list of degrees or a membership card to some elite club. That night, as the restaurant's sparkling lights reflected on those self-satisfied faces, I suddenly realized my whole life I'd been forced to play the outsider. But now I was ready to shatter that script. And even though I didn't know how this battle would end, I swore I would never again let people like the Wellingtons decide my future for me. Chapter 3. My Past and My Secrets. There are secrets that, if revealed, can destroy a life or save it. I know that better than anyone because I've lived a double life for nearly 10 years. Behind the appearance of an ordinary consultant, I hold financial power that even many seasoned CEOs would tread carefully around. But nothing comes easily. I was born into a family of Latin American immigrants, raised in a poor neighborhood in San Jose, where everyone knew each other's names, and dinners often ended with stories about relatives who had just lost their jobs. From a young age, I watched my parents struggle with bills, and dreams of Harvard or Stanford felt like fairy tales for rich kids. I chose a public university where the tuition was just low enough not to bankrupt my family, and just high enough that I didn't feel too embarrassed among friends who had everything. By my sophomore year, I was juggling no fewer than 3 jobs, at once waiting tables, tutoring, and freelance coding for small startups. No one taught me how to negotiate contracts, and no one opened doors or made investor introductions for me. I learned everything from scratch: how to fail, how to get back up, how to endure the snide remarks about my background and my abilities. The first time I tried to raise capital, I failed spectacularly, rejected outright, simply because I lacked pedigree, lacked a network. The idea was okay, but who would dare bet on someone like you? I still remember that night crying and swearing that if this world only handed out opportunities to those who fit the mold, I would create my own path. After graduation, I didn't join any big corporation, but stayed with small projects, investing from the modest savings I had scraped together. With every success, I reinvested, this time through shell companies under the names of friends and trusted partners. Gradually, that capital grew, multiplying through deals in AI, biotech, and edtech. I was patient, never flashy, always staying in the shadows to keep myself safe, and so no one would question how a mediocre girl like me could ever break into the upper echelons. The name Rodriguez Holdings, the conglomerate behind me, slowly became a discreet partner of dozens of investment funds, including Wellington's own TechFlow Ventures. I always avoided appearing in any files, any news articles, even creating an entirely separate resume for my consulting work, just enough to explain why I could live comfortably without working myself to exhaustion. My greatest success, perhaps, isn't the amount of money I accumulated, but that no one ever discovered who I really was. I used to think that if I just stayed silent, the world would let me be, and no one would point or judge anymore. But then I met Benjamin. He wasn't like any man I'd known before. Warm, sincere, simple, and someone who believed in people more than degrees or status. We met on a small project when he was a fresh out of school software engineer, and I was a tech consultant for a fledgling startup group. I loved him for his kindness, for the way he treated everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. I hid my investment past, not because I didn't trust Benjamin, but because I was afraid he'd feel small in the face of that truth. I didn't want our love to be tainted by numbers or comparisons with his family. Benjamin believed I was just successful enough, just stable enough for us to live peacefully together. He didn't ask much, and I didn't tell much. I told myself that as long as I stayed humble, this happiness would last. But life isn't that simple. Every visit to the Wellington family, every time I heard them talk about proper success, a storm churned inside me, especially after the dinner at Meridian, when all my patience curdled into humiliation. I realized the more I tried to hide my strength, the more people like Victoria and Miranda saw me as an ant under their heel. Maybe it's time for me to stop being the ghost behind powerful men and let them know real strength never flaunts itself, but when it's been looked down upon long enough, it can drown an entire empire in an instant. Chapter 4. Emotional Cuts. After the dinner. I can't even remember how I got home that night. Everything felt like a fast-forwarded tape, the blurry streetlights sliding past the window, the soft hum of the car, Benjamin occasionally glancing at me as if he wanted to ask something, but then stopping himself. There were long, suffocating silences, as if even the air in the car understood that any words spoken now would only make the wound deeper. As soon as the door closed behind me, I felt like I was free-falling into a void. I was used to judgmental looks and whispered gossip, but I had never felt so small, so alone and lost, right in the middle of a luxurious room. The worst part wasn't Victoria's veiled comments, nor Miranda's laughter. It was the glaring truth in their eyes. I would always be an outsider. Standing in front of the mirror, wiping away my faded makeup, I looked into my own red eyes and asked myself, why am I trying so hard to be accepted by people who never truly want to understand me? Childhood memories came rushing back, those times when classmates mocked me for being the poor kid. Even now, with more in my hands than they could ever imagine, I was still not enough to be recognized. Turns out my success meant nothing if it didn't come with the right pedigree label. Benjamin gently placed his hand on my shoulder. Don't be sad. I know my mom and Miranda can be a bit difficult, but they just want what's best for me. You know, in this family, everyone always has high expectations. I nodded, forcing a smile to reassure him, but deep inside, an overwhelming sadness rippled through me. I think if we just get closer in time, they'll change their view. You just need to be patient, and everything will be fine. I didn't respond. For the first time, I realized there was a gap between Benjamin and me that didn't have a name. A part of me wanted to scream, why do I have to be patient? Why must all my efforts only buy me a few fake compliments? But I stayed silent, just as I had all my life in the face of others' prejudices. That night, I lay awake for a long time. Every word, every glance from the dinner replayed in my head, as if all the hurts from my past converged into a single point. I wondered if I was just too sensitive, or if I was actually a weakling trying to please the whole world. But then in that silent moment, a cold anger began to grow inside me. I remembered everything I had endured, the all-nighters grinding on projects, the times I was excluded from meetings, the snickers behind my back, just because I dared to dream. All those cuts, only now did I understand they were not my weakness, but the reason I would never bow down. I thought of Michelle, of the silent investments, of the power I'd so carefully hidden just to keep life peaceful. But tonight that peace was dead. I was tired of living two lives, one as the just enough humble girl, and the other as the owner of hundreds of millions that no one dared to name. I started to wonder, if I used my real power, could I actually change anything? Could I make people like Victoria and Miranda see themselves for what they were? Make them pay for their arrogance? For the first time, the thought of revenge no longer made me feel guilty. On the contrary, it brought a sense of satisfaction, as if for the first time I was claiming the right to decide my own fate. Before I drifted into a restless sleep, I already knew I would no longer ask anyone's permission. I would no longer stay silent, and I would no longer let anyone, not even my husband's family, devalue me without consequence. That night, I decided the rules of the game had changed, and this time I would be the one calling the shots. Chapter 5. The Resolve for Revenge. The plan is set. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window blinds, I was already sitting at the small desk in our quiet bedroom. Benjamin was still sleeping, his peaceful face, a stark contrast to the storm churning inside me. Last night, I had accepted a truth I no longer wanted to be an outsider for even one more day. I opened my laptop, entered my triple-layer security code to access my investment accounts, the kind of thing no one in the Wellington family had any idea existed. The feeling of wielding such massive financial power was like sitting at a missile launch control. With just one click, the entire order of things could be upended. I called Michelle as soon as she got to her office. Michelle wasn't just my asset manager. She was the only friend who knew my whole truth and the only person clear-headed enough to recognize every risk. Hearing my hoarse voice over the phone, Michelle simply asked, "Did something happen?" April, I was silent for a few seconds, then replied, each word steady as a vow. "They've crossed my line. It's time we show the Wellingtons who they really depend on." Together, we went over the options. In reality, Michelle and I had considered this before, not because I was eager for revenge, but because we both knew that the world of venture capital runs on the fragile strings of trust and capital flow. If just one major link pulls out, the whole system can collapse. I had 3 options. 1, withdraw funds, gradually letting Wellington feel the pressure for themselves, but that was too mild. 2, pick the moments of their biggest deals, withdraw just enough to rattle them without revealing the culprit. And 3, the explosion scenario, pull the entire $250 million out coldly at their most complacent moment, triggering a devastating domino effect they'd never see coming. I chose the 3rd option because I didn't just want to make things hard for them. I wanted Wellington to understand what it feels like to be misjudged, excluded, forced to pay for their own arrogance. Do it, Michelle. All of it. Move everything to the Swiss accounts process through the 5 shell companies and make absolutely sure nothing leaks until I confirm the timing. Michelle was silent for a few moments, then exhaled. "April, I've never seen you this determined." "Are you sure the consequences will be huge?" I answered simply, "Absolutely. They need to learn to respect the people they think are invisible." That morning, I worked with my small client startups that truly appreciated my help, while silently moving hundreds of millions of dollars with just a few keystrokes. I realized real power isn't something you parade on social media or a wall full of framed degrees, but the ability to effect change quietly so that by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. All day, Benjamin kept texting, asking if I was okay, if I wanted to go out and relax. I only replied briefly, saying I wanted to focus on work. He had no idea that in this very room I was rearranging the order of an entire financial ecosystem his family was so confident they controlled. In the evening, when Benjamin came home, I made a simple dinner. He talked about how Miranda had just bragged about being invited to an international investment conference, and Victoria was discussing a major deal about to be signed. I listened, smiled, but inside I thought, enjoy it while you can, because every crown sits on a complacent head for only so long. When night fell, I stood by the window, looking out at the sparkling city lights. I knew by tomorrow the Wellingtons would realize the game had changed, and I would be the one rewriting the rules, not with words, but with cold, ruthless numbers. I had never felt so calm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt my own power, not as an outsider, but as the person who would change the game forever. Chapter 6. The First Crisis at TechFlow. When the final transfer orders were confirmed, I sat frozen in front of the screen, feeling both nervous and exhilarated. The first wave of the financial earthquake that Michelle and I had just set in motion was about to sweep through TechFlow Ventures, and I couldn't predict all the consequences. I just knew there was no turning back. On the first day after the withdrawal, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Systems at large funds like TechFlow always have a certain lag before the undercurrents surface. But I knew, somewhere in the sealed meeting rooms of the Wellington family, cash flow reports had started to show abnormal signs. Michelle sent me an update at 10 a.m. The funds have been transferred safely, no system alerts. The next 72 hours are the danger zone. If TechFlow can't recover, they'll collapse. That afternoon, I tried to keep my routine, replying to client emails, scheduling meetings with a startup that had just received seed funding. But every time the phone rang in the house, my heart pounded faster. Miranda called Benjamin at 5 p.m. Her voice casual, but I could clearly hear an anxiety I'd never heard from her before. Do you know if anyone's been withdrawing large amounts from the fund recently? I just saw finance send over a very strange cash flow report. Maybe it's just a mistake, but I still feel uneasy. Benjamin, innocent as ever, just shook his head. I don't know anything about the fund's investments. It's probably just big. Corporations trying to scare each other. I sat next to him, smiling perfectly, hiding the terrifying silence inside myself. The next day, the uneasy atmosphere had spread. Michelle messaged panic signals showing. TechFlow has temporarily frozen some disbursements. Victoria and Miranda are calling more than a dozen partners to check information. I imagine them in emergency meetings, numbers flickering across screens, faces once so confident, now mottled with shadows of doubt and fear. In my peaceful home, I cooked, read, and sometimes sat quietly for hours, just observing everything around me, feeling the hidden tremors pulsing through Silicon Valley. I never thought there would be a day when I could control the fate of such powerful people with just a single click. But that was the truth. All their self-assurance, all their arrogance, rested on invisible cash flows they had no idea belonged to someone else. On the third day, the undercurrent became a storm. Miranda called Benjamin 3 times in a single morning. Her voice came over the speaker this time, stripped of all pride and full of anxiety. Ben, I need to ask again. Does April know anyone withdrawing money from the big funds lately? Maybe she's heard something on the startup side. Our portfolio companies are demanding disbursements, but the fund is getting margin called. If we can't sort this in 48 hours, all the deals will collapse in a domino effect. Benjamin was starting to feel confused, gently asking me, "Do you know anything? Is there any startup you consult for that's sold shares, or have you heard anything about the market?" I just shook my head, trying to look just the right amount of surprised. I only know my own work. I'd never get involved in something that big. Outside, TechFlow was like a computer under internal attack. Every department in chaos, project directors sending urgent emails about cash flows, emergency meetings back to back, and Victoria, the woman always calmly commanding every boardroom, now starting to lose control. That evening, I received a brief email from Michelle Official Movement. TechFlow has had to halt disbursement for 3 major projects. Some small affiliated funds are getting worried cascade effect, highly likely. They still haven't traced the source of the withdrawal. I sat there in the dim light of the living room, quietly sipping tea. My mind swirled between the thrill of victory and a vague anxiety. Had I just become the manipulator I used to despise? Or was this simply justice, something they'd long deserved? Suddenly a message from Miranda popped up on Benjamin's phone. I can't sleep. If everything collapses tomorrow, I'll never forgive whoever did this. I set my teacup down and closed my eyes. A chill seeped deep into my bones, but I knew I couldn't stop now. At this point, either they collapse or I lose any chance to ever be myself again. I whispered just loud enough for myself to hear, "Welcome to the real game, Miranda." This time, the supporting character will rewrite history. Chapter 7, Relentless Revenge. The First Shocks. If anyone ever believed that power would forever be an unbreakable shield, then surely they've never experienced the feeling of the ground being swept out from under them by an invisible current, leaving them helpless. 3 days after my funds left the Wellington house, once as solid as a fortress, was now shaken more violently than any earthquake I'd ever known. And I, the side character in their story, had suddenly become the one holding the heartbeat of their entire empire in my hands. That day, the tension in my home was thick enough to cut, even though no one spoke it aloud. Benjamin was no longer as carefree as usual. His eyes kept darting to his phone, and every time it rang, he jumped. Miranda texted constantly, her messages growing more desperate with each one. Someone is messing with us. The portfolio accounts have been locked. Mom just called an emergency board meeting. The bank refused to raise our credit line. If we can't move funds today, everything will collapse. Reading those words, I felt a strange mix of sympathy and satisfaction. So even those who seemed invincible could one day taste the bottom of fear and powerlessness, just like all the fledgling startups who once begged them for a chance. Victoria could no longer maintain the composure of the queen of the boardroom. According to Benjamin, she was nearly losing her mind, constantly calling limited partners, even writing pleading emails herself to investors she'd once dismissed as mere assistants. "I've never seen Mom like this," Benjamin whispered over dinner, his voice heavy. "She's really panicking, and Miranda seems on the verge of tears every time she texts." I stayed silent, just nodding, as if to share my husband's concern. But inside I knew that, for the first time in her life, Victoria Wellington was feeling the insecurity of the outsiders she'd always looked down on. Miranda's fourth call that day came with not just her voice, but someone crying in the background, probably Victoria. "We've checked the entire system. There's no technical glitch. The money disappeared too fast. No one could react in time. Who would do this? If the fund collapses this time, my family will lose everything. I'll have nothing left." Benjamin turned to me confused. "Do you have any idea who could possibly pull this off? Or have you heard anything from the startups? This one is too big. It's not like any usual crisis." I shrugged, doing my best to appear calm. "I really don't know. Maybe the market's just too volatile, or maybe some fund got too scared and pulled out." I knew I was lying. But honestly, I no longer felt guilty about it. Maybe when someone keeps stomping on your worth, eventually you stop punishing yourself for fighting back. That night, Victoria sent Benjamin a long, rambling email, no longer polished or professional, but full of panic. "Son, I don't know what to do anymore. Everyone's turning their back. The board is demanding answers. The bank is forcing us to add collateral. Miranda can't stop crying. If the funds don't return tomorrow, everything we've built will vanish into thin air." Benjamin took my hand and whispered, "I don't know what will happen. I just hope this ends soon. If my family has done anything to hurt you, I'm sorry." I squeezed his hand gently. Sometimes people need a crisis to see who truly stands by them and who is only an ally to power. Inside me, there was not only a cold satisfaction, but a small ache. If one day Benjamin found out the truth, would he still hold my hand like this? But I pushed that thought aside. Right now, I knew exactly what I had to do. Keep going without hesitation. When a system runs on prejudice and contempt, its collapse is sometimes the only way for people to relearn the value of humanity. As night fell, I looked out at the city, the dazzling towers, the investment funds, once thought as solid as mountains, now suddenly fragile in the face of a silent decision. I knew that tomorrow the real tsunami would arrive. And this time there would be no escape for those who once believed themselves above it all. Chapter 8. Unmasking. The collapse at the power table. Monday morning, the sky was gray, as if foreshadowing the coming storm. Benjamin left for work early, but I knew there was no way he'd be able to focus on any line of code today. TechFlow had sent out an email summoning all major shareholders, even names that had never appeared at any previous meetings. I received an invitation email with a subject line that was brief and chilling: emergency board meeting, 10 a.m. Sand Hill Road. Beneath Victoria's signature, for the first time I saw her use the phrase, request. Your urgent presence, no longer a polite invitation, but a desperate cry for help. I put on a simple business outfit, no elaborate makeup, no need to appear powerful. I knew that my presence alone as the one who had just withdrawn 40% of the fund's capital was enough to draw stunned gazes from all around. The atmosphere at TechFlow's headquarters was completely different from usual. The receptionist no longer smiled. Employees clustered in groups of 5 or 6, everyone's face etched with anxiety. I entered the elevator, their eyes both curious and wary, as if trying to guess who I was in the domino chain that had just thrown the entire company into chaos. The main conference room was spacious, flooded with light from glass walls, overlooking all of Silicon Valley. But today the air was thick with tension. Victoria sat at the head of the table, haggard, her hair hastily tied up deep shadows under her eyes as if she hadn't slept in days. Miranda's eyes were red and swollen, tears still drying. Harrison, the always dapper gentleman, now looked as if he'd just survived a mild stroke. James, the chairman of the board, arrived last. He gave me a polite smile, a subtle, knowing nod that only made Victoria more flustered. No one was smiling. No one had the energy to be arrogant anymore. Victoria began with a shaky speech. Thank you, all for coming. As you know, TechFlow is now facing the most severe liquidity crisis in its history. A major investment was unexpectedly withdrawn, triggering a series of consequences. Deals stalled, banks calling in loans, partners demanding answers, the fund's reputation under serious threat. If we can't find a solution, TechFlow may be forced to liquidate assets on a massive scale, possibly shut down entirely. All eyes turned to me, still sitting quietly at the end of the table. Miranda lowered her voice, almost pleading. April, do you know anything about the funds that were just withdrawn? If this is a misunderstanding, if there's still a chance, we're begging you to help the fund through this. If there's a disagreement, please say so. We're willing to listen. The future of hundreds of employees of our entire family is in your hands. I raised my head and looked directly at the three people who once sat across from me at Meridian, recalling every mocking smile, every condescending glance. I spoke slowly, every word echoing in the silent room. I'm just a small consultant who once sat listening to you talk about pedigree, about limits of background, about real success. I used to think I wasn't worthy, but it turns out real value doesn't lie in a diploma or a LinkedIn profile, but in actual ability and perseverance, in the ability to survive every painful fall. James unexpectedly spoke up gently, but with absolute authority. I think we need to clarify something. April Rodriguez is not just a limited partner, but the person behind more than 40% of TechFlow's operating capital over the past 8 years. You all once prided yourselves on your people skills, on your network of talent. But today, it's that very prejudice that has destroyed everything you've built. The room plunged into absolute shock. Victoria opened her mouth to object, then, as if drained of all energy, collapsed into her chair. Miranda buried her face in her hands and wept. Harrison was silent, his eyes reflecting the sight of his world collapsing. I didn't smile, didn't look triumphant. What I felt was not gloating, but an emptiness tinged with a bit of regret for those who had built their own prison out of blind faith in power and bloodlines. James closed the meeting with an irrevocable verdict. TechFlow will undergo a complete restructuring. The old board will answer to the shareholders. You are all required to step down. A press release will go out today. This collapse will be a costly lesson for the entire Silicon Valley investment ecosystem. I left the boardroom under the gaze of those who had just lost everything, my heart calm and undisturbed. I knew my greatest battle had just ended, but a new chapter for me and for all those who had always been looked down upon as outsiders was only beginning. Chapter 9. Aftershocks. The Power and Price of Authority. As I left TechFlow's headquarters. That day, the chilly early spring wind whipped through my hair, but I felt a different kind of weight had just lifted from my shoulders. I stood in the parking lot, quietly watching the sun peek out from behind the Silicon Valley skyscrapers, a place where power had once been a cloak that covered every mistake, every arrogance. But today, that cloak was torn to shreds, and everyone could see the truth. Sometimes the invisible person is the one holding the fate of an entire system. My phone rang nonstop. Michelle called in, her voice trembling. I just got over 20 investment proposals from the biggest funds in America. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, even sovereign funds from the Middle East want to meet you. You've become the center of attention. I let out a soft, slightly bitter laugh. For nearly 10 years, I'd hidden myself quietly, scraping together every cent, every small deal. But just one night after a single battle, all the attention, every invitation, every network of power came swarming to me like moths to a flame. On social media, the investment world buzzed with rumors about the historic collapse of the Wellington family. TechFlow, the name once the pride of the whole clan, was splashed across every financial news site, accompanied by the words liquidity crisis. Analysts dissected causes, speculated about the mastermind. Some claimed I was the mysterious investment queen of Silicon Valley. Others insisted I was merely a pawn of something even bigger. I just laughed. They would never believe that a girl from a public school with no pedigree, no billionaire relatives, no elite network, could rewrite the rules of an entire industry. Victoria and Miranda, the women who once ruled every boardroom, now vanished from the media's radar. I heard Victoria was forced to sell her legendary Atherton mansion to pay off the bank, while Miranda was mercilessly blacklisted by dozens of investment funds. Harrison tried to maintain social ties, but no one dared shake hands with the man who just presided over a historic downfall. For Benjamin, the first days were a blur of chaotic emotions. He was confused, devastated by his family's collapse. But what surprised me most, he did not blame me. "I just wish everyone could understand what you've been through all this time." Benjamin held me tightly, eyes red. "You deserve respect. Not just for your money or your power, but for everything you've survived, everything you've overcome." In that moment, for the first time, I felt light. Maybe I no longer had to be afraid, no longer had to shrink away under anyone's scrutiny. But at the same time, I understood the price of power. It brings not only respect, but also loneliness, pressure, and a sense of guilt, even when the victims truly deserve to be punished. In the weeks that followed, I quietly turned down every interview, refused million-dollar strategic consulting offers, and focused only on the small projects I'd always loved. Young startups founders rejected by big funds just for not having the right profile. Michelle smiled and said, "Maybe you're the only person in the world who's destroyed an empire and tried to build a new ecosystem, one where outsiders finally have a real voice." I realized what I'd been seeking was never just money or pure revenge. It was recognition, but not the kind that comes from those who once belittled me. It was recognition from within. I allowed myself to step into the light. No more apologies. No more bowing my head. No more living a life of fake humility. Every evening I sat in my quiet room, looking back on the journey I'd just taken. There was a time when I thought I would always just be April, the public school consultant, in the eyes of the Wellington family. But now I'd become April, the game changer, whether this world liked it or not. And I knew the road ahead would no longer be a lonely one. I would use this power not for revenge, but to create an ecosystem where people like me, those once excluded, once scorned, would never have to hide again. Preserving all meaning, structure, and emotional resonance. Chapter 10. The loop ends. A new circle begins. A month after the TechFlow explosion, everything around me had changed at dizzying speed. The Silicon Valley investment world was still abuzz about the woman who toppled the Wellington empire, and the press called me, by half-reverent, half-sensational nicknames, the Silent Titan, the Ghost Queen, the Queen without a profile. But all that noise was now just a distant backdrop compared to what I was pouring my energy into in the present. Because after true power revealed itself, I realized if I stopped at revenge, I would simply become another version of them wielding power only to secure my own place. I didn't want to become Victoria 2.0. Instead, Michelle and I joined forces to build Rodriguez Ventures, an entirely new fund where the only condition for funding wasn't pedigree and Ivy League degree or a glamorous network of friends, but courage and the will to overcome adversity. I'll never forget the first day. The fund launched, looking out at a room full of young faces, women once rejected by big funds for lacking potential immigrant men who'd been dismissed, founders who'd never had a mentor. I knew within each of them was a story waiting to be rewritten. We didn't just give out capital, I mentored. Directly hosted practical mindset classes taught them how to negotiate with investors. Without self-doubt, taught them how to protect their dreams without bowing their heads. Every small success of those founders brought me more satisfaction than any bank balance ever could. Someone once asked April, "Why don't you stay in those flashy penthouses, keep ruling the young billionaire rankings?" I just smiled, because I know power only matters when it's used to open doors for others, not to close them. Sometimes I'd receive thank you emails from founders who'd once been rejected by Miranda or Victoria, now running their own companies, raising capital successfully, coming back as mentors for the next generation. This current, I believe, will never stop flowing. As for the Wellington family, I heard Miranda had moved to Austin working at a small startup with a modest salary. Victoria had withdrawn from major boards, and Harrison occasionally sent Benjamin long emails explaining, apologizing. Benjamin and I also had to take our own difficult journey to find balance again. He needed time to accept that his wife was no longer just a simple consultant, and I had to learn to forgive myself for hiding the truth for so long. One evening, we sat together on the balcony watching the sun set behind the glass towers. Benjamin was silent for a long time before suddenly turning to me and squeezing my hand tight. "I don't know if any of this was worth it, but I do know without you, no one would have dared to hit reset on a system this old." I rested my head on his shoulder, smiling. Sometimes it just takes one person brave enough to be the outsider, and all the old loops fall away on their own. I don't know how many more challenges, doubts, or new masks of old power await me in the future, but I am certain of one thing: my own circle won't end with revenge, but will expand through new opportunities for every April in the world. Because fairness sometimes begins with a single crack from the one who was once valued least in the boardroom, and I will never let anyone ever again be forced to sit at the outsider's table. Chapter 11. Resonance. When your existence is an act of justice. There are still nights when I lie awake asking myself, if on that day I hadn't been brave enough to step out of the shadows, maybe TechFlow would still be an empire. Victoria would still be sitting on her throne of power, and I would still be playing the role of the good wife at the edge of every party, living a modest life just to please others. But as time goes on, I've come to understand that no one in this world is truly on the sidelines if they are persistent enough and dare to seize the right to define their own worth. I've met so many people who once thought they were invisible: a single mother in the suburbs of San Jose, an immigrant student from India, a trans friend who'd been excluded from every mentoring program, just because his name hadn't yet changed on the paperwork. Each of them, even if just once, dared to speak up, dared to face prejudice, and each left a crack in the wall of power that once seemed unbreakable. And I realized the greatest power in this world isn't in a bank account or in a mansion with a private nameplate, but in this you dare to become the best version of yourself, no matter how judgmental the world may be. I've begun to thank those who once looked down on me. Because of them, I learned pain, learned to hate, and finally learned to forgive both them and myself. I thank Benjamin for loving me for who I truly am, even when that truth sometimes scared and unsettled him. And I know I will continue to use everything I have money experience, even the most painful failures, to give opportunities back to those who were once excluded, who once had to endure humiliation like I did years ago. There's a quote I love one I wrote in my student notebook. Sometimes your very existence is already an act of justice for an entire generation. Now, I believe that more than ever. If you, the one listening to this story, have ever been April in someone else's eyes, remember, they have no idea how dangerous you really are until you finally step into the light. And sometimes all it takes is for you to stand up, and the whole world will have to relearn how to respect what they once looked down on. You've just listened to a journey where recognition didn't come from flashy compliments, but from the strength to stand up even if you're standing alone. If I, a public schoolgirl with no profile, once belittled right in front of my husband, who endured every kind of emotional wound, could rewrite the rules of an entire industry, then you can absolutely do what no one ever believed you could. Sometimes silence is stronger than any justification. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is building a world where those once excluded are the very first to be given a chance. If this story has touched you, leave a comment about the moment you wanted to give up and the moment you chose to keep going. Don't forget to subscribe to Scarlet Vows so you won't miss stories of empowerment, justice, and revenge told in the real voices of those who were once outsiders, just like you and me. Because justice doesn't have to shout as long as you never give up. And sometimes your quiet perseverance is already the most beautiful revenge for every hurt you've ever suffered.